When four armed men walk into a pub to assault a single target, the outcome is statistically guaranteed. The numbers dictate that the victim will be overwhelmed, beaten, and likely hospitalized before they can land a meaningful counterattack. This is the logic that governs the criminal underworld. It is a logic based on intimidation, mass, and the rational fear of death. But on a rainy Tuesday night in the East End of London, a hit squad sent by a rival organized crime syndicate walked into a venue controlled by Lenny McLean and discovered that their mathematics did not apply. They expected a victim. They expected a man who would weigh the odds and submit. Instead, they watched Lenny McLean walk calmly to the front door, slide the heavy iron bolt into place, turn the key in the deadlock, and drop it into his pocket. He turned back to the four assassins, who were suddenly realizing that the room had shrunk around them, and delivered a sentence that has become one of the most chilling lines in British criminal history. "Now none of you are getting out." What followed was not a brawl. It was not a scuffle. It was a systematic dismantling of four human beings by a man who had been forged in the fires of abuse so severe that he had lost the ability to process fear. By the time the police arrived, they did not find a victim. They found a slaughterhouse where the only man standing was the one who was supposed to die. This is the comprehensive story of how the king of bouncers, the man they called the Guv'nor, locked himself in a cage with a Mafia hit squad and destroyed them with his bare hands. To understand the mechanics of that night and how one man could voluntarily trap himself with four killers, we must first autopsy the creation of Lenny McLean. He was not born a monster, he was manufactured. Born in 1949 in Hoxton, East London, Lenny entered a world still broken by the Blitz of World War II. But the violence of the streets paled in comparison to the violence inside his own home. When Lenny was a child, his mother married a man named Barry Jimson. Jimson was a sadist, a man who derived pleasure from the systematic torture of a child. This is not hyperbole. By the time Lenny was 10 years old, he had suffered a broken leg, broken ribs, and a fractured jaw. The abuse was daily and methodical. Lenny would later recount memories of being beaten unconscious, waking up covered in blood, only to be beaten again for bleeding on the carpet. This childhood trauma served a dark evolutionary purpose. It stripped away his flight response. In a normal human brain, pain triggers fear, and fear triggers a desire to escape. In Lenny's brain, pain became a familiar baseline. He learned that pleading did not stop the violence. Only endurance did. He developed a pain threshold that was medically baffling. He could take punches that would knock out heavyweight boxers and simply smile. The abuse calcified his empathy for his opponents and removed the hesitation gene that prevents most people from inflicting catastrophic damage. By the time he hit puberty, Lenny McLean was already a dangerous weapon. He grew to be 6'3" and weighed over 20 stone of dense muscle. He was a giant who had been taught by his stepfather that the world was a war zone and that the only way to survive was to strike first and strike hardest. By the 1970s, the landscape of London organized crime was shifting. The era of the Cray twins, Ronnie and Reggie, was over. They were locked away, serving life sentences. Their departure created a massive power vacuum in the London underworld. The rigid feudal system where everyone answered to the firm had collapsed into chaos. Dozens of smaller gangs, or firms, sprang up fighting for control of the lucrative protection rackets, gambling dens, and club doors. In this chaotic ecosystem, the doorman became the most important soldier on the chessboard. If you controlled the door, you controlled the venue. If you controlled the venue, you controlled the drug trade inside. Lenny McLean became the ultimate gatekeeper. He wasn't just a bouncer, he was a sovereign state. When Lenny stood on a door, that pavement belonged to him. He operated in a legal gray area. The police hated him, but they also relied on him to keep order in the roughest pubs in London. Lenny's reputation was such that his mere presence was usually enough to stop a riot. But in the late 1970s and early 1980s, new players were entering the game. Syndicates with connections to international organized crime, groups often referred to colloquially in the East End as the Mafia. Though they were often a mix of Italian-American influence and hardened North London firms, wanted to expand their territory. They viewed the independent gatekeepers like Lenny as dinosaurs. They wanted to install their own men on the doors to push their own products. Lenny McLean refused to step aside. He beat up their dealers. He threw their representatives through plate glass windows. He cost them money. The decision to eliminate Lenny was purely business. The rival firm decided that the Guv'nor had to go. They didn't want a war. They wanted a surgical removal. They assembled a team of 4 enforcers. These were not local drunks looking for a fight. These were professionals, men paid to break legs and crack skulls. They were armed with koshes, weighted batons, and possibly blades. They were given the location of the pub where Lenny was working. The plan was standard. Enter the venue. Intimidate the patrons into silence, surround the target, and beat him until he was permanently disabled. A crippled doorman cannot work. A crippled doorman serves as a warning to others. When the 4 men entered the pub, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Lenny, standing behind the bar or near the entrance, depending on the account, clocked them immediately. A lifelong predator recognizes another predator. He saw the suits, the lack of drinks, the eyes scanning the room, the hands hovering near pockets. He knew this wasn't a social call. Most men in Lenny's position would have done one of 3 things: called the police, ran out the back door, or armed themselves with a bottle or a bat. Lenny did none of those things. He analyzed the tactical situation. If he fought them with the door open, they could retreat if they started losing. Or more likely, one could distract him while the others circled behind. Or they could run to their car and retrieve firearms. Lenny made a strategic calculation that is studied by combat psychologists to this day. He decided to remove their exit. By walking to the door and locking it, he achieved 2 things. First, he physically trapped them. Second, and more importantly, he psychologically castrated them. The hitmen walked in, believing they were the hunters. When the lock clicked shut, they realized they were the prey. The silence that followed Lenny's declaration, "None of you are getting out," was heavy with the realization of a fatal error. The hitmen looked at each other. The confidence evaporated. They were no longer 4 professionals doing a job. They were 4 men locked in a cage with a silverback gorilla who wanted to kill them. The fight itself was a masterclass in the brutality of bare-knuckle combat. Lenny McLean was the reigning bare-knuckle champion of Britain. He had fought Roy Shaw, the Devil, in a trilogy of fights that are legendary in underground boxing. He knew that street fighting is not boxing. There are no rounds, there is no referee, there is no bell. In a multiple opponent scenario, speed and extreme violence are the only variables that matter. You cannot trade jabs. You have to liquidate the immediate threat. Lenny launched himself at the leader of the group before the man could fully draw his weapon. For a man of 280 pounds, Lenny moved with terrifying speed. He didn't throw a punch. He threw a piston. His right hand conditioned by years of hitting skulls without gloves, connected with the leader's face. The sound was described by witnesses as sickening, the audible crunch of cartilage and bone collapsing. The leader was unconscious before his head whipped back. He didn't just fall, he was deactivated. Now the odds were 3-1, but the dynamic had shifted. The remaining 3 men were witnessing their leader destroyed in a split second. Hesitation is death in a street fight, and they hesitated. Lenny didn't. He used the environment as a weapon. He grabbed the second man by the lapels of his expensive jacket. Lenny's grip strength was legendary. He could crush an apple in one hand. He drove the man backward, using his immense body weight as a battering ram, slamming him into the bar or a table. The impact knocked the wind out of the attacker. Lenny followed up with a headbutt, the East End kiss. A headbutt from Lenny McLean was not a nudge. It was a collision with a bowling ball. The second man went down with a shattered nose and orbital fractures. The remaining 2 men were now panicked. They were trapped. They fumbled for their weapons. But the psychological terror induced by Lenny's roar and the violence of his assault made them clumsy. Lenny turned on them with a manic grin. This was the zone Lenny spoke of in his biography, a state of red mist where he felt invincible. He cornered the third man. The man tried to swing a baton. Lenny absorbed the blow on his massive forearm, barely flinching, and countered with a hook to the body that broke ribs. The man crumpled, gasping for air that his lungs couldn't draw. The fourth man, seeing his 3 colleagues destroyed in less than 60 seconds, reportedly tried to scramble towards the locked door. He was clawing at the wood, trying to get the key. Lenny grabbed him by the back of the neck and the belt, lifted him off his feet, and threw him across the room. The man landed in a heap of broken furniture. Lenny stood in the center of the room, chest heaving, knuckles raw, surrounded by 4 groaning, broken bodies. He checked his pockets, took out a cigarette, and waited. When the police arrived, alerted by the noise or by a passerby who saw the commotion through the windows, they had to ask Lenny to unlock the door to let them in. The scene inside was carnage. It looked like a bomb had gone off. The police arrested Lenny, of course. In the eyes of the law, he was a violent maniac who had assaulted 4 men. But the investigation revealed the weapons the men were carrying. It revealed their criminal connections. It revealed that Lenny had not fired the first shot, figuratively speaking. Lenny's defense in the subsequent legal proceedings was a mixture of Cockney charm and brutal honesty. He argued self-defense. He argued that he locked the door not to trap them for torture, but to prevent them from fleeing to get guns, or to prevent innocent members of the public from walking in on a hit. He played the role of the protector. "I didn't want them hurting anyone else," he would say. The jury looked at Lenny, a man who looked like he could punch through a tank, and then looked at the 4 victims who were known enforcers. They made a decision based on the ancient law of the street. If you come for the king, you better not miss. Lenny was often acquitted or given light sentences in these types of cases because juries were simultaneously terrified of him and charmed by his adherence to a code of honor. He didn't attack civilians. He didn't attack women. He only destroyed people who entered his arena. This incident did more than just hospitalize 4 men. It cemented Lenny McLean's status as a mythical figure. In the underworld, reputation is currency. After the locked door incident, the contracts on Lenny stopped. The rival firms realized that the cost of doing business with Lenny McLean was too high. You couldn't just send a crew to beat him up. You would have to kill him. And killing a figure as high profile as Lenny would bring down a level of police heat that no firm wanted. Lenny had effectively punched his way to immunity. The story traveled fast. It was whispered in the pubs of Bethnal Green and shouted in the boxing gyms of Canning Town. It became a warning. It validated his title as the Guv'nor. But it is crucial to place this violence in the context of his rivalry with Roy Shaw. Roy Shaw was a certified maniac, a man who had spent time in Broadmoor Hospital for the criminally insane. Shaw was a skilled boxer, powerful and ruthless. Lenny's fights with Shaw were not street brawls. They were unlicensed boxing matches attended by thousands. Lenny lost the first fight, a defeat that ate at his soul. He quit drinking, trained like a demon, and came back to destroy Shaw in the rematch. The locked door incident occurred during this peak period of his physical prowess. He wasn't just a bouncer, he was an athlete of violence. The hit squad hadn't just walked into a pub. They had walked into the training camp of the deadliest man in Britain. Lenny's legacy, however, is complex. To some, he was a bully, a thug who glorified violence. To others, he was a folk hero, a man who stood up to the bullies and the organized gangs. He was a Robin Hood figure, with a criminal record. His later life saw a transition that few expected. He began acting. He wrote an autobiography that became a bestseller. He found a kindred spirit in a young director named Guy Ritchie. Ritchie saw in Lenny the authentic face of the London underworld. He cast Lenny as Barry the Baptist in the seminal film Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels. On set, Lenny was a professional. He was gentle with the crew, respectful to the other actors. But the menace was real. The scene where Barry the Baptist threatens people wasn't acting, it was memory. Tragically, Lenny McLean never saw the film's release. He was diagnosed with lung cancer and died in 1998, just weeks before the premiere. The film was dedicated to him. But while his film role introduced him to a global audience, it is the story of the locked door that defines him to the people of the East End. The anatomy of that night serves as a final lesson in the psychology of dominance. The Mafia hit squad made a fundamental error. They assumed that violence is a tool used to achieve an end. For them, breaking Lenny's legs was a job. For Lenny, violence was a language, a home, a state of being. He didn't lock the door because he was brave. He locked the door because in his mind, the violence was inevitable, and he wanted to ensure it was total. He was the executioner who decided that the sentence would be carried out immediately. Today, the East End of London has changed. The old pubs are becoming gastropubs. The cobbled streets are filled with coffee shops. The era of the hard men is largely gone, replaced by cybercrime and faceless drug syndicates. But the legend of Lenny McLean endures. It endures because it speaks to a primal human fascination with the ultimate warrior. We live in a society governed by rules, laws, and safety nets. Lenny McLean lived in a world where the only law was the one you could enforce with your fists. The story of the four men who walked into a pub and didn't walk out is not just a crime story. It is a modern gladiator myth. It reminds us that there are people who walk among us who are built differently, forged in trauma and hardened by combat, for whom a 4-on-1 fight is not a death sentence, but an opportunity. The hospital reports for the four men read like a catalog of trauma injuries: fractured mandibles, broken ribs, concussions, internal bleeding. They recovered physically, but their reputations were incinerated. In the underworld, you cannot recover from being locked in a room and beaten up by your target. They became punchlines in a joke told by Lenny McLean. They were the men who brought a knife to a nuclear war. And Lenny? Lenny just unlocked the door, lit a cigarette, and went back to work. Because he was the governor. And the door was always his to control.